When we go back to the main trail, kind of you joining the Jay Forrester System Dynamics group here at MIT in the early 70s, what was it, what was the main question that Jay wanted to investigate, and how did that fit with your own interest and the way you took the work forward?
When I first started to get involved working with Jay Forrester here, two studies had just been done and completed, and they were both looking at urban evolution, how cities grow over time and go from being economically vibrant to being concentrators of poverty and hardship, economic hardship. It was called Urban Dynamics, and a new project had just started. Literally, when I arrived, it was just starting. It was the first effort to use these same basic simulation tools. I mean, keep in mind, Jay, having been, in some sense, the father of digital computation, was literally the father of computer simulation. The first simulations ever done in the world were done on some of the computers Jay was building. So he really believed that simulation could be a way to, again, extend our awareness. And they were building this first simulation of the Earth as an integrated system: economic development, population growth, resource depletion, and all the side effects today, like climate change, like ecosystem destruction, the side effects of, you'd say, industrial activity and the pollutants, whether it's CO2 or local pollutants in rivers or air environments. But nobody had put that all together in a kind of rigorous way. That became almost overnight a global bestseller. When it was published in paperback, it was called The Limits to Growth. And virtually all of the core sustainability issues that people talk about today were embedded in that original model. That model was completed in 1972, 73, and it was published in 1974 as The Limits to Growth. Within 2 or 3 months, it was a global phenomenon, because all of a sudden, MIT scientists predict the end of the world. That was the kind of journalistic treatment, which of course was accurate and not accurate at all. It was basically saying, if we continue on this path, we're going to get where we're going. And what do we say, all of us today, typical estimate of, we use about 1.5 Earths today. So this was back in a time when we used a little less than 1 Earth, but the trajectory was very clear. It was basically looking at the structural causes of economic growth, population growth, resource depletion, pollution, and how they're interconnected, and we're on a trajectory.
It basically launched the global environmental movement with maybe 1 or 2 other books.
There were 3 books that were published in the 60s, 2 in the 60s and 1 in the early 70s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, which I think was 1968, and then The Limits to Growth, 1972. So yes, those 3 books really created the global environmental movement.
So you became part of that, and what is it that you noticed being inside that group and then developing your own work?
Well, I was drawn to it because I was looking for more rigorous ways to think systemically. And naturally, as a person trained as an engineer, I gravitated initially to this tradition, which really comes out of engineering. The main conceptual breakthrough that Jay had really advanced was that the real systems that underpin our society, that connect social activity and environmental activity and all these webs of interconnection, are highly nonlinear. They can't be analyzed with the simple linear models that engineers have used. Consequently, he said computer simulation is vital. But the part of it that I thought was really more interesting than just a computer simulation was that you could say the exact same thing about our mindset. We're trained. I don't think this is innate. I think trained is the right word. We're educated. But if you look at our education as a kind of training in a very linear extrapolationist worldview, we see this leading to this, leading to this, and then we just extend the line and we see the next piece. Where in fact, living systems are much more complicated. Obviously, rhythms, cycles, all natural systems operate in cycles. We do as human beings, as do all the systems around. So that's obviously not just a simple extrapolation, but it's more than just that. The really interesting part of nonlinear dynamics, to use a technical term, is things change. the system can be operating in this way for a certain period of time, and then it can flip and operate in a very different way. Now that could be catastrophic, so we could have a highly stable overall environment for life like ours on the planet for a couple million years, but then it could flip and become very adverse, but it can flip other ways too. So that's what I think really intrigued me, was nonlinear systems are not predictive. They really have structural causes and structural tendencies, but they can flip. It is literally the technical definition of a nonlinear system. It can generate multiple modes of behavior, and those can be triggered or flipped, actually sometimes quite surprisingly. You know, you're moving, all of a sudden, kaboom, things collapse. You know, we know this from being around people who get really sick, right? The exact same dynamics. This organism is very robust over a wide range of temperatures. We can bundle ourselves up, we take care of ourselves, we get sick, our body heals itself. The miraculous phenomenon of healing is profound. And we watch it. You get sick, and all of a sudden something tips. And we see that. You know, that's when a person suddenly goes from being robust to dying in 2 months, right? Because the whole system tips. So that's what
and we know it from all history, right? Kind of, there are periods in history where everything is more of the same, kind of a little bit changing this direction or that direction. And then there are moments or periods of disruption where suddenly very different patterns can take shape.
Yes.
And many people feel right now we are living in an instance of the latter.
Yep.
So what, in dealing into system dynamics, what is it that, you know, from a science base is contributed to how we deal with these situations that we know do exist, but we don't know how to deal with them?
Well, but we're oriented. You know, we know a Renaissance occurred, and there have been Renaissances, tips like that in many cultures' histories around the world. So we're kind of naturally interested in that, and I think that if we look at even a superficial understanding of what happens in those time periods, again, there's a phenomenal part and there's a consciousness part. You know, suddenly painting, take European history, goes from being very kind of idealistic. You look at the painting of the 11, 12, 1300s. It's not that people didn't understand perspective. They didn't actually use perspective. The idea of perspective has been around since the Greeks, right? But they didn't use it. The paintings are flat. They weren't really interested in depicting reality. They were interested in depicting an idea. So there's kind of an idealism in that painting, and maybe often religious, right? So you had a person and you saw an aura around them. All of a sudden, realism becomes important, because in the Renaissance there's a mindset shift that the human being is part of the phenomenal world, and if we orient our consciousness in that way, it'll have profound aesthetic effects. So then we have, you know, a Leonardo and a Michelangelo right there, and there, you know, Michelangelo literally is spending much of his life studying cadavers so that he can really understand the musculature, not so he can get it technically correct, but so that he can evoke something that pulls people into their reality, not away from their reality. Obviously, the sensibility in Europe, in the what we call the Middle Ages or even Dark Ages, is to kind of step out of reality, right? Because your whole life is just a preparation for the afterlife. So there's nothing that an aesthetic world is doing except helping you step out of that reality, because that was the orientation, that was the consciousness. All of a sudden in the Renaissance, you're stepping into this reality, because it's not just about the afterlife, it's about the beauty and joy of living right now. So that just illustrates that these deep shifts, these epical societal shifts, have, you might say, ultimately, they're aesthetic. Because I think aesthetics is what integrates our inner world and our outer world. That's why art, ironically today, you know, art has always had it over science in a particular way. Yes, science is important, that understanding of the external phenomenal world. But at some level, only when it becomes aesthetic does it cross the boundary of the internal and the external. I think great scientists do that. I think that's what an Einstein, that's what Umberto Maturana do. These extraordinary scientists who are deeply into understanding the phenomenal world in a way that they're never forgetting, what does it mean for me? Who, as Umberto says, Umberto Maturana, a very famous Chilean biologist, who one of his great sayings is, all things said are said by somebody. So you can't make a statement about the external world without you making the statement. But of course, we know the blind spot of modernity was everything becomes so oriented out there, we forget that there's somebody over here seeing what's out there. And that's why that movement of reflection, turning the mirror back and saying, oh yes, I'm seeing something out there, but I'm doing the seeing. To me, that's where real science, where science becomes, I will say, an aesthetic undertaking. And science and art become basically two modalities which operate in a deeply connected fashion.
So you mentioned aesthetics. So the term aesthetics goes back to the Greek term aesthesis, which is connecting with your senses. So it's really, initially, it didn't come with the meaning of art, but it came with the meaning of the senses, activating the senses. So I wonder, if you look at the evolution of systems thinking from that angle, what's the relevance of it? And isn't it, sometimes systems thinking has been criticized being actually lacking that very dimension.
That's right.
And being overly, intellectual, or just linking to the mind and not to the other part. So how would you see that evolution?
I think one of the truly profound contributions of Theory U and the work on presencing in the context of an evolution of a systems worldview. Because that's what I do see is going on. We are gradually evolving a systems worldview compatible with the actual reality in which we live today. So it's not the systems worldview of a Native American who lived 1,000 years ago, or a Native Asian, who found in the beginnings of Taoism, 15,000 years ago. It's a systems worldview compatible with today's world today. I think the shortcoming of systems thinking as it evolved in an academic environment was all just about thinking. Theory U kind of introduces us to systems thinking and systems sensing, as you might say, two sides of the same coin. So not only how am I understanding it in some intellectual or conceptual sense, that's very important, how am I feeling it? What's the intelligence that I can bring forth? Because the intelligence I can bring forward in any setting, I think, will come from the two, from our systems, our conceptual understanding and our immediate feeling understanding. Do I have a sense of what's going on in this room right now? I mean, you can have all kinds of models for why a team doesn't work, but ultimately the group of people have got to get to a sense of themselves, an awareness of themselves, so, a little bit akin to what a group of musicians would have of each other, or a theater troupe in dance, or a theater group performing some play. So this kind of awareness of the whole is the necessary complement to the thinking about the whole. In the evolution of the systems work, I think the MIT contribution of real clarity around principles of systems thinking, the importance of the feedback loop, the importance of delays, the importance of nonlinearity, as I was talking before. This, you might say, the conceptual underpinnings, but it only really leaps into full impact on reality when it's combined with the ability to activate and develop our sensory understanding. Because then it becomes a feeling as well as a thought.
Where have you seen so what does that look like if that plays out in the real world?
Well, I think the first place I really started to understand this connection of the systems thinking and the systems sensing, you might say the phenomenal and the consciousness aspects of this journey, was in teams. We did a lot of work. Really, in many ways, the foundational work of the fifth discipline, tools, was really working in teams and small groups. And you could just get to a certain point, they have all these conflicts, people aren't saying what's really on their mind, the conversation, people are kind of waiting for it to end. Nowadays, of course, they'd all be playing under the table with their device, but you can see it's not really engaging people emotionally. But then you would see a shift. And I can remember so many vivid examples where a group would suddenly see something going on collectively, the whole seeing the whole as a whole. And typically, I'll just give an example from the engineering, where a lot of times the projects were engineering projects, people building new products, new automobiles, new computer systems. And I'll remember vividly being with a group where this was an automobile context, and they were having a lot of trouble meeting their targets. They had these really demanding technical targets, which always had to do with functionality, cost, and timing, because you're building a new product, and you got the product perfect, and the cost is great, but you're 2 years late, doesn't really matter. So you're always working with these three things: the functionality, the cost, and the timing. And this group, which was very talented people, were always missing the timing. They just always were missing the things. They had great things, but they'd be 6 months late. And then everybody's scrambling like mad to get the product out the door at the last minute. And then you compromise the functionality and the cost, but you're doing all this stuff at the last minute in a flurry of activity, but not really an orderly discovery process. So anyhow, and they actually had done a systems map, and they were looking at the various ways that different people, different things that could cause them to be behind a schedule target. And there was this part, and there was this part, and there was this part. There were about 5, 6, if I remember, almost 8 different feedback dynamics. Now those involved different people in different parts of the organization, but they were all kind of sitting around the table because you had the head of all those different engineering groups. And I'll never forget, as this map comes, and we've talked about this a lot, so it's very real, and it's very painful experience for them. They're very competent people, and it's really painful to see you be systematically, consistently incompetent. And they were looking at this map, and you could feel the room got quieter and quieter as they put this part of it up and that part of it up. And oh yeah, that's what happens when our battery people are behind, and that's what happens when our electronic fuel handling people run into trouble, and all the different quick fixes, all of which invariably were inadequate. This was the system as a whole, and that awareness started to creep in. You could see that it was not the individual pieces that were the problem, it was the way the whole system was functioning. And they started to get a representation of this on the wall, a map. And as this map was coming together, the room got quieter and quieter, and then somebody said, well, yeah, I think this is a part of it. And people go, And then somebody said, well, but yeah, there's this part. So you could really feel this quieting of the room and people paying more and more attention together to this picture of their reality. And I'll never forget, a moment came, and one of the people, almost under his breath, but he was like expressing what was everybody's mind, he just said, look what we are doing to ourselves. And in my mind, I had, the penny dropped. You could feel it like kaboom. The whole space of that room. Because, there was no other truth in that moment. As they could see more of this reality, they could feel the effects and feel the pain and feel the anger and all that stuff, but then see that, no, this was them doing it. And he just said, look what we are doing to ourselves. At that point, you knew things would change because there was a collective seeing of the collective. So that's why I'm saying, this understanding the outside, feeling the inside come together in a single aesthetic reality. A collective awareness of the collective had by the collective. And you knew things would change. I mean, they didn't even have to make a plan at that point. They could see the reality. Now, eventually they had to make plans, and they'd come up with some new targets and all that. But it was about a year later that they were getting ready to launch this car. It was a big new model year car, maybe 2 years later. But within a year of that, they had started to break all sorts of records. They had finished stuff that nobody ever finished that soon. They actually completed the whole car basically a year in advance, assembled it at full line speed because you only got to start assembling prototypes to check out your manufacturing process. And they did it all about a year ahead of time. And it was quite astounding. I think somebody used the analogy of a laser at that point. Rather than all the light going in all the different directions, the laser focuses that same amount of power in an extraordinary powerful point, and that's where that team had started to become. I saw that several times. I watched these teams shift, and once they shifted and they could start to stabilize a different quality of awareness, their ability to change the systems they were part of were amazing. Now, these systems, of course, were teams of people, maybe several hundreds of people working together on a big new product in the context of an organization, in the context of an industry. So at that point, you might say, I heard the music. And so by that point on, I could start paying attention to where this music was occurring. And then I would start to bump into it we had a wonderful 25-year partnership with a group in rural Uganda. They've done amazing things. And recently, about 5 years ago, built the first rural women's university in Africa. This was the poorest part of Uganda when they started working there 30 years ago. And then ROCA, this organization that's quite close to where we're sitting right now, mostly all former gang members, who've totally transformed the way a whole very poor, very crime-ridden urban environment has been working. So I think from that point on, I just kept looking for the music. And whenever I could feel it, I say, ah, yeah, that is going on there. And now I think that's going on all around the world. I encounter people in the middle of this, I guess you call it collective magic, happening in a lot of places. But of course, it's new, it's fragile, we don't always understand it. It may manifest and then not be very robust and go away. Oftentimes people don't have a very good understanding of what's going on. None of us probably do. I think Theory U starts to give us a way of seeing this phenomena, so that maybe when the phenomena is occurring, when we're actually in these collective, creative flow experiences, we also can understand it a little bit more. So it does become more robust.
So I want to come back to your story, kind of look at what we are doing to ourselves. And like you, I have seen several of these instances, and I also believe that this is much more distributed in many of our ULAB participants will have had their own experience of that kind, where, as you said, the collective is becoming aware of the collective and seeing it, or you could say where the system begins to see itself. But if I'm honest, I don't really understand what's going on there. And when you say the collective begins to see itself, what do you really mean? I mean, is that like you and I sitting here? So we are using our physical eyes, we are looking at something, and are you saying that someone else is seeing, it's not me, it's the collective? What really does that mean? Do you use that term, the collective begins to see itself? Do you use that as a metaphor? Or do you talk about a shift in a more literal sense? And what really does it mean? So that's a question I know exactly the phenomenal instance that you talk about. Right. And I think many people recognize that. But how to actually think about it, how to actually, what actually does happen there, still, honestly, is a mystery to me.
Well, yes, it's a mystery. And that may not mean that's beyond our understanding.
Yes.
But what it means to understand a mystery is different than what it means to understand a puzzle once you've solved it, right? Then you kind of see what has to be done, you can do it again. Einstein once said, the most beautiful experience in the universe is the experience of the mysterious. He then added, it is the source of all art and science. So there's something about being willing to just be with the mystery, hold the mystery, live with the mystery, not try to reduce the mystery. But it is terribly important. I'm just going to restate it because it's so important. Many people are having these experiences. So it's not it's not just an idealization. It's not just a theory in the sense of a conceptual possibility. And it's not even woo-woo, strange. It's just mysterious. When nobody said it cannot be reduced to concept. It cannot be reduced to a symbolic explanation, like this happens, this happens, this happens, or even a feedback loop explanation. But that said, as I was listening to you pose the question, at least for me, when you said, I think we really don't understand this, and I agree with you completely. I think first it starts with acknowledging mystery as mystery. But secondly, I think our struggles with this have a lot to do with an overly individualized sense of awareness. So let's just step back and look at it culturally now for a minute. As Westerners, you and I are both Westerners, I think it's impossible to recognize how subtle and pervasive is the Western individualism. That, I am me. right? I'm born me. I'm born a body. I'm born a persona. Oh, I have family and all that. When I first started spending a lot of time in Africa, it was in the late 80s. I encountered something which I didn't know how to make sense of at the time. This was when apartheid was still very much in force. We were doing a lot of work in South Africa. It was a wonderful time to be there. But you could feel the old order crumbling all around you. No one knew what would happen. And of course, the odds were very good there would just be more conflict. If you look back at what happened in 10 years between like 1987 and 1997, for South Africa to go through the transformation from apartheid and totalitarian government to a democracy without large outbreaks of violence is surely a miracle. No one would have ever believed that. So you could feel that happening. I really think one of the things that happened there is very pertinent to what we're talking in now. So I'm there in 87, 88, and working with a wonderful group of people. We're training to lead our 3-day leadership course. Blacks and whites, co-leading, of course, for blacks and whites, all of which was illegal at that time, particularly for the blacks. The whites could get in a little bit of trouble, but the blacks could get killed, because they were breaking from their ranks to join these groups of whites and blacks together, really thinking deeply about what it meant to be a leader for systemic change. But I would encounter the African culture. And I'll never forget, we were doing this workshop out at a pretty remote place out in the country, and I'm always visiting with the staff wherever I am, and I'm getting to know these people, and of course they're all black Africans. And I noticed that I would get to know them at 2 or 3 days. They would keep saying my name every third or fourth sentence, say, Peter, da-da-da-da, Peter, da-da-da-da, Peter. And it was very strange. It felt to me as like a formality. So I went to my white South African friend, who was one of the co-organizers, and I said, Louis, would you please explain to me why these people keep saying my name to me? We've gotten to know each other. It seems very odd. He said, Peter, you must understand African humanism. In their consciousness, you start off as a relationship. And your life journey is to individuate, almost a mirror image of ours. So he said, for them, speaking your name acknowledges you as an individual in relationship. Because otherwise, we're just a web of relationships. That was my first direct encounter with this profound individualism of the West. We start off as individuals and we seek to build relationships. The African starts off as a relationship and seeks to become an individual. Now, both journeys are important and perilous. Obviously, the tribalism of Africa can be very dysfunctional. They never individuate, so no one can object and express their own voice. And we know for any kind of real harmony, you need an interplay of that social awareness and the collective. But it was such a powerful thing to see that, no, they start off as relationship, and their life journey is to individuate. So it's a real honor to say the person's name, because you're reminding them, and you at the same time, that, oh yes, you're you. This is what I think why we struggle with the mystery. Because if we could imagine that mind, awareness, consciousness is not just individual and maybe spreading out, but it actually starts collective and spreads in. The Buddhists have probably the most sophisticated theories of mind I've yet encountered, because they've been at this for 2,500 years, and many, many branches and theories. But the first problem a Westerner encounters, really understanding deeply Buddhist theory, is that for us, mind is an individual phenomenon. The eighth consciousness and the eight consciousness theories, there's one branch of Buddhist theory called the eight consciousness. The eighth consciousness, the eighth aspect of mind, is the totality of the universe, both what's manifest and what's infinite. That's mind. So for them, mind starts as the totality of everything. It's called the alaya consciousness. And by the way, it can be either unawakened or awakened. If it's unawakened, it's like everything there, and the internal and external very fragmented and separate. But if awakened, it's literally the awakening of the collective mind. If we accept the possibility that consciousness is not just an epiphenomena of our neuroanatomy, not just something produced by an individual and then they interact. So that's the Western orientation. It's not good or bad. I think there are two pathways to understanding. So you start with the individual and then you look at this webs of interaction, or you start with the whole and you look at individuation, or the manifestation of object, you might say, or separation, the manifestation of separation. Then all of a sudden the mystery is much less problematic. Then you go, there's awareness here. It's not just my awareness, there's awareness. One of the best recent writings I've encountered on this is from actually a transpersonal psychologist named Christopher Bache, B-A-C-H-E, who's written about what he calls sacred classroom. He uses classroom as a teacher for years to explain. He said, I would notice this phenomenon in my classroom where all of a sudden it becomes magical. And people are making comments to other people. People say, I was thinking that, and you said it. He says, all these serendipitous events start to occur. He said, and I've come to kind of understand that choreography. And he just calls it sacred mind. It's his way of talking about this collective awareness that manifests collectively. I think our only problem really understanding this is I want to understand it. Otto wants to understand it. I, coming from my individual consciousness, am trying to understand this. That would be basically like red trying to understand blue. I mean, there's a different phenomenon, it's a different occurrence here. But if we just hold, and at the individual level, we would experience it as mysterious. Because it's beyond the capacity of our individual awareness to hold, construct, maybe even sense at some level. But from a collective perspective, not at all. That's why I always go back to the arts. Because people in performing arts, collective performing, usually have very deep understandings. Talk to, improv comedians, like the Blue School guys. The Blue Man Group created a school in New York. And, they're improv. And their understanding of this is so deep, but you got to keep coming back to it again and again. How something just arises, that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but it's a collective arising. That I think that's the limit we're hitting there. I don't think it's impossible to work with this, and that the key point, practically, what we all care about, is how do we keep cultivating, building this capacity, collectively and individually. So that over time, more and more, it can be having the impact that's needed. But I think we'll have to give up ourselves as an individual. Which, of course, is one of the things you start to understand when you really start to look at what's going on at the bottom of you, when past and future start to dissolve as basically an artificial conceptual boundary. There's obviously no future and past, not really, they're just now. They start to dissolve. Individual and spatially. Individual and other start to dissolve. The subject-object consciousness, which is what the Buddhists would call it, the subject-object consciousness starts to dissolve. So there's just consciousness. And within that, as I said before, subject-object is still there, just like past, present, future can still be there, but they're small. They seem so small compared to this expanded awareness. And that awareness is generative. My favorite definition of samadhi. In Buddhism, there's all these different levels of samadhi, which are basically different calibrations of degrees of enlightenment. My favorite definition is they said the basics of samadhi is your actions no longer are generated by karma, nor do they produce karma. So you're no longer in that past, present, future time flow. You're in a different reality, neither acting out of karma nor producing karma. It's a human possibility. And that's what I was alluding to before. I said, we have this immense capacity which we can barely even imagine. And it's that capacity that now is essential for our survival.